Good to go.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Beautiful Struggle. With me, I have William, Alexis, and I'm Brandon. Black Advancement, Inc. is a nonprofit organization that seeks to create a unity within the Black community through action and discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about the wealth gap and why it exists. So we're actually going to start off with William. If you want to give your take on why you believe the wealth gap exists.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So the Center for American Progress, in regards to the wealth gap between Blacks and whites, states that the persistent Black-white wealth gap is not an accident, but rather the result of centuries of federal and state policies that have systemically facilitated the deprivation of Black Americans. So, just the way my take on that is that Black people came to this country involuntarily in 1619, first came to Virginia. Well, the first documented folks came to Virginia. These folks were perceived to be either free or enslaved. We did a tour of Jamestown with my son, and there was some question as to whether these people were slaves or free people. In my opinion, they were treated as slaves regardless of their actual status. So looking at it from that aspect, from the initial Africans stepping foot on North American soil, in 1619, they were treated as property. From 1619 going forward, to the end of the Revolutionary War in 1776, a majority of Black people in the United States or the colonies, or however you want to look at it, were treated as property. Of course, there were some Black people that were free. There were some Black people that owned slaves as well, but for the most part, they were considered property as well. From 1861 to 1865, the Civil War was being waged to determine the fate of Black slaves in the United States. As a result, Black people were freed after this war. Taking that into consideration, during the Reconstruction period, 1865 to 1867, that's when Black people started to kind of get some rights and kind of got the ability to own some things on a larger scale. Of course, that was taken away at the end of Reconstruction and lasted for about 100 years during the Jim Crow era. So looking at it from that aspect, from about 1867 to approximately 1965, Black people were still subjugated to cruel laws, cruel people, extreme punishment, and just a number of different measures and things executed by the government and just by the majority of folks in this country. So taking that into consideration with the wealth gap, when did Black people as a whole really start to get the opportunity or get the position to gain wealth on their own versus when the majority of white people or the descendants of white people in this country started to get that opportunity to generate wealth? And taking all of that into consideration, it looks like we had about a close to 350-year deficit in getting that process started. And even when there were some opportunities for some of our descendants, some of our grandparents, uncles, family members, neighbors, when it was an opportunity for them to generate wealth for themselves and for their families, they experienced a number of different obstacles in building that wealth for themselves and their family. So I say all that to say that it looks like by design, Black people in this country are supposed or looked at to be a permanent underclass or to never have as much as white people in this country. So I'll leave that there.
Great points. Alexis, your take on it?
think I would just build off of what William is saying in regards to systemically, laws have been put in place that have made it hard for Blacks to build wealth. I mean, if you look at what was it, the 13th Amendment that was put into place in 1865, we weren't allowed to own property. We weren't allowed to accumulate wealth of any type. We weren't allowed to have anything until that time frame. And even though laws were put into place saying that we could, we were still beaten, killed, and everything else in between if we went out and got, nicer jobs, which we weren't allowed to have. Really, in the law, it said that we really could not have certain jobs. We couldn't live in certain areas. So we still weren't allowed to buy homes and things of that nature. But that was for an additional 100 years after slavery, and I put in quotation marks, ended, right? So we were still segregated. We were still put out farther than where the better jobs were placed. So if you look at that time between 1865 up to 1930, when the Social Security Act went into place, we're still out there. A lot of our grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers were domestic workers. A lot of our great-great-grandfathers were farmers or sharecroppers of some type. And then the Social Security Act of, I think it was 1935, went into effect. And that what the government did was exclude domestic workers, and they also excluded farmers, which were generally our people. So that meant that if we accumulated something, we still weren't allowed to pass it down to, or they weren't allowed to pass it down to our grandmothers, our mothers, so on and so forth. And then you start moving on up to the Jim Crow era in the 1960s, right? So we finally get to the point where we can work, we can start building, we can start saving, but we still can't get certain jobs. We're still not allowed to live in certain areas. There's just a lot of things that ultimately the government is saying that we're not allowed to do. So you have the systemic racism, you have the government sanctioned racism, right? And I think, number one, that's the first thing that was put in place that created the wealth gap. Another thing I think that created the wealth gap, and I can't say like, oh, we have a whole lot of research about this, right? But what we do know is that there were a lot of massacres. There was the Tulsa massacre. We know that there was a massacre in Arkansas. There was the Rosewood massacre. And what these created that you don't necessarily see research for is that it created fear, right? So you have these communities where we're building banks. We are finally thriving. We are doing well. We have true communities where you have dual income households. You have the mom and the father in the household. Kids are getting educated. We are doing well. And then our cities are burned. And it's kind of like playing Monopoly, right? And for 100 years, they say, okay, come to the table, you can play with us, but we're not going to give you any pieces. Then they finally say you can play, but they burn down all the money that you have. But they still keep saying, come on to the table. Now you don't have any money, you don't have any pieces. They bought up Boardwalk and everything else. So another 100 years of you doing that, then finally they say, okay, we're going to stop playing with you, you can come back to the table. But at this point, they own everything. So if you really start to look at it, if we're looking at the Jim Crow era, 1960s, my father is from Virginia. He didn't desegregate until his senior year in high school. So if you're really looking at this, we are really the first generation that has gone through life without having to deal with segregation or having to deal with these laws that have oppressed us. So this is part of the reason why this wealth gap exists. And we know that there was smoke and mirror and fear and everything else. And we know this because it was October 2021. That's when the American Psychological Association or Psychiatric Association issued an apology, because all the studies that they were putting out there were actually geared toward white supremacy, and they did not actually take Black people into account. So if you're looking at stuff like that, that also affects our education. It affects the standardized tests that we're taking, such as SATs, GREs, everything that would help us advance as Black people. And lastly, what I will say is one of the things that I think truly affects our wealth, besides, the laws and the education and things of that nature, is taxes. taxes are progressive, and they essentially really take more from those in lower income positions, which is typically going to be us. Because if you look at how COVID ravished the Black community and how we lost our jobs, because we're working the jobs that are at minimum wage. We're working the jobs that, are trade. And essentially, when they start letting people go, it's going to be us, not the white collar jobs in corporate America. So I think taxes is the next thing that really affects our wealth, and not just our income, because I think people really mix up income versus wealth. But I think taxes is one of those things, because the more we start to make, if you start increasing minimum wage, but you don't change the tax code, we're the ones that get affected. So I think those are some things to me that affect, that have increased the wealth gap.
All great points. I've done a lot of research on this, and even though I have my own personal opinion, I'll start with the research. The biggest thing that I would think the current racial wealth gap, to me, is the consequence of many decades, many centuries of racial inequality that impose barriers to wealth accumulation, either through explicit prohibition during slavery, as you guys mentioned, or unequal treatment after emancipation. Examples of post-emancipation barriers include legally mandated segregation in schools, which you guys talked about, legally mandated segregation in housing, discrimination in the labor market, and the biggest one is redlining, which reduces access to capital in Black neighborhoods. So the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland did a study literally from 1962, right before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, up until 2016. And the biggest thing that they saw had to do with timing. And they said the Great Recession had a larger impact on average Black wealth than on white wealth. And again, things that happen throughout our society are things that help define why things are the way they are. So again, let's start with slavery. You guys are talking about it, but in 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in the United States. And for centuries, enslaved Black people built the country for free, contributing to its economic advancement. In the mid 1800s, when cotton was the largest commodity, free labor provided by Black people helped the United States export cotton so cheaply, which accounted for more than, I believe, 50% of the country's export. White slave owners saved trillions of dollars in labor. Wealth was built in the white community until the end of slavery in 1865. Then, at the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln signed a document promising to grant enslaved Americans abandoned land as property as reparation for slavery. However, he passed away shortly after, and then Andrew Johnson refused on the agreement. And so while owners of formerly enslaved people received monetary compensation for losing property, enslaved Black people were released without being given a fair shot at success. So wealth was built on the backs of Black Americans, enslaved Black Americans. When slavery was abolished, they were left without any possessions or even a place to stay. And then on top of that, and Alexis mentioned this as well, they're one crime away from being legally subjected to involuntary servitude, specified in the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as a punishment for a crime. So, that's the slavery aspect. Then we can go to segregation. Shortly after the end of segregation, Black codes, locals, state laws dictating Black American behavior around different aspects of life started to appear in some parts of the country. And to me, that's just absolutely ridiculous. Codes were a way to ensure that Black people would keep providing cheap labor, slavery, and that white supremacy would continue. A study that I read wrote that Mississippi African Americans were forced to sign a yearly labor contract that stipulated they could not leave their employer before the end of the year. Violating the contract resulted in being forced to give up wages they had earned earlier in the year and risk being beaten and arrested. These Black codes slowly became the norm in most southern states, created room for Jim Crow laws, which made segregation legal in the South and expanded to northern states. I mean, even when you look at that in and of itself, to me, it's completely ridiculous. It's just absolutely asinine. There are areas where Black people are not allowed to coexist with white people. Black people learn to be self-sufficient. It's absolutely ridiculous when you think about that. So another thing that I talked about was redlining and ultimately subprime mortgages. The American dream is for everybody to own a home. Well, subprime mortgages helped lend to the downfall of America and also of Black people. So redlining began, I believe, it was in the 30s with the Homeowners Loan Corporation. I believe that's which was a federal agency that was created to provide mortgage assistance to homeowners at risk of foreclosure or who were in default. They developed what are called residential security maps, in which marked neighborhoods with a large number of Black residents. So the Federal Housing Agency, which was created around the same time, will not insure mortgages in redline areas, identifying them as too risky. And I mean, when you look at it like that, I mean, that is the quintessential definition of holding a group of people back when it comes to being able to demonstrate wealth. And even though housing discrimination became illegal in 1968, Black people continue to suffer from the consequences of redlining, other forms of housing discrimination, such as subprime mortgages. So before the 2007 recession, Black Americans were more likely to receive a subprime mortgage loan compared to white Americans, even though they had a good credit score. Following the recession, the Black community lost close to 50% of wealth. As a result of redlining and subprime mortgages, most Black families could not build wealth through their home ownership. And so there was a study that was done by the, again, also by the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, where it broke down the differences from, and this is just from 1984 to 1994, and it goes down to the type of assets that Black people held versus white people. So the study said that 64% of white people held home equity, 21% held real estate, 13% held farmer businesses, 32% held stock, 85% held checking and savings account, 87% had goals, 26% had other savings, and 49% of them had some semblance. Whereas Black people, them holding assets, 38% was in home equity, 7% was in other real estate, 2% was in other farmer business, 8% was in stocks, 45% had checking or savings accounts, 58% had vehicles, 14% had other savings, and 44% of them actually. But if you actually look at the assets that you have as a percentage of your actual assets, so with white people, 31% of them had home equity. So out of all of their assets, 31% of it was home equity. 17% of it was in real estate, 17% of it was in a farmer business, 13% was in stocks, 14% was in checking and savings accounts, 6% were tied to vehicles, 5% were other savings, and 3%. Whereas with Black people, 49% of their overall asset makeup was tied to real estate, 9% was in other real estate, 9% was in the farmer business, 5% was in stocks compared to the 13% for white people, 12% were in checking and savings account, 10% were in vehicles, 9% were in other savings, and 6% were in other sectors. So when you look at it, the comparison shows that assets in white households are more concentrated in real estate, business, and stocks. These assets tend to be riskier than other categories, but they also provide a higher average rate of return. And really, that's what it comes down to when you're talking about trying to build wealth. You know, Alexis made mention of it perfectly. There's a significant difference between income and wealth. And in order to, again, to be able to accumulate wealth, in order for it to grow, you need to invest in higher investment. You know, I literally could talk to you guys to death on stats as it pertains to things that happened to Black people from the start of time, from the start of our time here in America up until now. You know, I'll leave it. I'll leave that part of it alone for right now. So, so let's do this. Let's talk about this collectively as a group. You know, everybody has made great points on this matter. Are there any other areas that anybody can think of that we didn't touch on, or are there areas that we did touch on that we want to expound on a little bit?
So it's a little bit of both there. Stuff that we can definitely expand on. You made some great points there. I don't know if we actually really said education.
We did not.
You know, that's another big area for us as Black people, right? I kind of, it's not funny to some extent, right? When I look at my student loans, I'm like, oh my Lord, but well, I see your face on that one, right? But it hit us hard, especially our generation got hit hard. And the laws were, again, that's something else where the laws were put in place to hold us back. Where, and this is where I say smoke and mirrors, right? We were told that we needed to get educated. We were told we needed to buy homes. our generation, a lot of people from our generation, we're the first ones to go to college, right? So we went to college, and now we got these tens and hundreds of thousands of student loans, of dollars worth of student loans, right? Or they told us to go buy homes because we needed assets. We buy homes, but we don't own the land. Or we buy homes and our name is attached to it, whereas if you look at other people, they're taught to put their name in an LLC, go buy the asset, so that if anything ever happens, it doesn't really affect you. It'll affect your LLC and you're still covered. You're still good. Were you taught that? Did your parents pass that on to you? Because my parents didn't. And the other thing I would say to that is I'm listening to you, Brandon, great points there, right? I think I was reading one of those same studies, and it was basically saying that since COVID hit, our wealth, the wealth of the Black community is now, the medium wealth of the Black community is now 50% of that of our white counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's significant. And so not only do we not have enough to stay in our, for the money to stay in our community, but we don't even have enough to really survive. So.
I mean, you brought up, great points, especially about education. I mean, the way that I look at education, I mean, we were taught it's the most common way out of poverty, but, studies have shown that a school that a child attends is usually tied to where they live. Obviously, school spending has a positive impact on the quality of education that you receive, but higher school spending tends to be in areas where property value and family income are higher. I mean, this is no, it's no secret. Schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods, Black communities, are in lower income areas and usually have fewer resources than predominantly white neighborhoods, sometimes up to $1,000 per student. Black neighborhoods also tend to have a higher teacher to student ratio, which means less instruction time and lower teacher compensation levels. And as a result of that, students tend to test lower on standardized tests, which decreases their chances of attending college. Is the way out. And I read, and I'm see if I can find my note here, but I think it was 2009 McKinsey study. The average scores of Black and Hispanic students on standardized tests was 2 to 3 years behind the average score for white students at the same age. And I mean, to me, that's absolutely asinine to think about. But at the same time, if you look at how our society and our system is set up, it makes perfect sense. Again, we talked about student loan debt ratio. I mean, that too is significant. I believe, 2018, on average, Black college graduates owe $7,400 more than their white peers upon graduation. A few years after graduation, it grows exponentially. Black students are more likely to be the first to graduate from college in their family, because again, we were told out, and they actually end up, according to studies anyway, being the ones who have to financially support other family members because they're now the higher earners. So here you have a situation to where you are the most successful person in your family, and in turn, you now have to support other people. And the downside of being that is that, again, that into the ability for you to be able to accumulate wealth. I know there was one other thing that I wanted to touch on that most people may not agree with, but another thing that has kept Black people now from being able to accumulate wealth, or why the wealth gap exists and why it's is drug legislation and mass incarceration. During the 80s, crack cocaine was mainly prevalent in Black neighborhoods. In response to the epidemic, lawmakers, they passed a series of legislation that continue to increase racial inequities in the United States. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 created a 100-to-1 sentence disparity between crack and powder cocaine. 100-to-1. So 100 grams of cocaine were equal in sentencing to 1 gram. I'm sorry, 100 grams of cocaine were equal to 1 gram crack. I mean, it's that in and of itself is just ridiculous. But again, I guess in essence, what I'm saying, because of the legislation that was passed in the 80s, whether it was, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, or the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, was passed in '94. This led to mass incarcerations of Black and Latino men, and a significantly larger portion of that compared to their white counterparts. While Black and Hispanics comprise, I think it's like 30% of the U.S. population, they represent close to 60% of the prison population. And a lot of that, the increase came in the 80s and 90s after the advent of those laws. And even still, I'll give you an interesting parallel with the crack epidemic is the opioid. So as opioids have mainly affected the white community over the past decade, the government took a different approach on how to combat the issue. Faced with the crack epidemic in the Black community, the response was increased policing and prison sentencing. But with the opioid crisis, the government, it literally took a therapeutic approach, evidenced by campaigns looking to address the issue outside of the legal system. So, I mean, racially biased drug legislation has contributed to growing, and it's going to continue to. Higher incarcerations are also going to result in children in the Black community growing up without a father. That same father who may be able to pass on, wealth knowledge to their child at some point in time.
No, I agree that definitely plays a part in it. And I know you mentioned the disparity between crack sentencing and cocaine, powder cocaine sentencing. I think a thing that also needs to be considered is the fact of where this cocaine was coming into the country. And also, who allegedly provided the formula to manufacture crack. So that always plays a role, and that's something that's always considered. And keeping in mind, in comparison with the opioid epidemic, this is a pharmaceutical, for the most part, it's pharmaceutical corporations, that are providing these opioids. Even though there are some that are, I believe, coming from other countries and being, filtered in, through normal illegal drug trafficking routes. But taking that into consideration is from the opioid standpoint, is coming from a quote unquote legal entity versus an illegal entity that was taking place during the crack epidemic. So, that makes me look at it almost from like a systemic perspective of whether this, it's almost like Black and brown people, it's almost like it's accepted. There's no real, what's the word I'm looking for? I think it is what it is. That's how the government looks at it. And that's how a majority of people in this country might look at it, as it's almost expected for, our communities to, experience such hardships, while when it's on the opposing foot, it's as you mentioned, received with a totally different empathy and level of care for that.
So that's a great point, right? We look at the opioids, and this is something, I hate to say it this way, but this was something that was manufactured. I might take some flack for this. This wasn't manufactured by Black people. Let me put it that way, right? This was an epidemic that was manufactured by white people and corporate America. The crack epidemic was manufactured by white people, but it was done to us. When they are doing something to themselves, they're trying to fix it. When they are doing something to us, they're trying to put us behind bars for something that we didn't cause. And it almost seems like they find different ways. I'm trying to, and I don't want to put this on everyone when I say this. So I'll put that disclaimer out there. Not everyone is bad, right? But we know some people don't write laws for us. And when we say, like, why does this wealth gap exist? They found the cheat code, right? The whole reason why we started having these mass incarcerations was, as going back to what Brandon was saying, once we came out of slavery, they needed a way to get the work done. Like, that's how the White House got built, right? That's how DC, if you look at DC, that's how DC got built. with all the different monuments and things of that nature, because it's something as simple as somebody spitting on the sidewalk, you would get arrested and then you would have to go back into, slave labor essentially. And that's what they were doing. So when you look at, throughout time, a lot of the railroads and things of that nature, that's how they were able to build them, because people were not, spit on the sidewalk again. Okay, let's go ahead and lock you up. And then let's put you back to work. And I'd almost be a little curious to see what was going on in the 80s that that needed to be built, right? Like, why did we need to be locked up again? What needed to happen? What was going on? The reason why they started putting stuff out there into our community that made us need to be locked up again. Was it about, were we thriving? Were we a threat to somebody? Was something going on? Like, what was was our community being built? Is that the reason why you needed to tear us, why somebody needed to tear us down in order to make the rest of America thrive?
To me, it almost looked like it was a response to the civil rights movement, and just the progression of Black folks in the country. That's, I mean, just taking into consideration, that's probably the only thing I could see right off the top of my head. Because when did the crack epidemic start? Like late 70s, early 80s? That checks out. That's would line up with that.
So I guess here's the question that I have. Is there a solution to closing this wealth gap? Or at least a feasible, viable solution that, if implemented, would close the gap? Does that exist? Is there a solution?
I mean, there's no one solution, right? I go back to saying, change the tax codes for sure. I look at what the last administration did with the taxes and how they made it easier I think they removed, was it like the inheritance tax, I believe it was?
Mm-hmm.
I think so.
Do you have an inheritance? Like, who's most likely to have an inheritance, right? So I bought a home during the pandemic. When I went to go and file my taxes, which normally you get a huge tax break when you buy a house, I got nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So who's most likely to be buying first-time homes and things? It's going to be us. We aren't getting these breaks. Corporations are getting the breaks. People that have money to pass down, estates, things of that nature, those people are the ones that are getting the breaks. And it's typically not going to be people of color. But the other reason why I say change the tax codes is because it affects our income. So it has to be twofold. Change the tax code, but in addition to that, you have to raise minimum wage, because our people are most likely going to be the people that are working in these minimum wage jobs. We're also going to be most likely to be working in these minimum wage jobs that are farther out from the city. So if you really want a better job, you're going to have to travel in, which means that it's going to cost more for us to do that, right? And I'll put it into perspective. I live in the DMV area. A lot of people live about an hour to 2 hours away from the DC area, from DC, and they have to travel back and forth to work. And that's even for something, I want to say something minor, but that's even for a minimum wage job, right? So if you're making $10 an hour, by the time you get on the metro or you actually are driving in and you spend $50 a week or twice a week for gas.
Yeah, you owe money.
Exactly, right? You're eating up your whole paycheck. So let's make it easier for people that are making less money to keep what they're making. So that's one thing we need to do. Let's also open up access to education. The reason why our student loans, and I won't even tell you how much I owe student loans, it's more, that thing's serious. But the reason why, first of all, it keeps us out of wanting to go to school, number one. Number two, we're going, but we don't have disposable income, because a lot of our money is going to student loans, or it's going to this cost of living, or just trying to get back and forth to work, just whatever it is we need to survive. So we need to remove the barriers for people that look like us, that live in impoverished areas. Because the other thing about these impoverished areas, I think as Brandon mentioned earlier, you're not going to get equity in these homes. You're not, right? So, and this goes back to a study a few years ago. If you look at the housing crash, was it 2008? And again, I go back to PG County. I go back to DC area, PG County. PG County has the largest area of African Americans, like within like a certain, within a populated area. I'm not talking like Atlanta, which is like an overall city or anything like that. But if you look at the overall history of PG County, when slaves started to settle, that is an area, when slavery was over, that's where a lot of the slaves settled. And that's why you have a large population of Black people there, because historically that's where generation after generation where they stayed. You go and look at PG County compared to Montgomery County, which is on the other side of DC, right? PG County didn't turn over. Like the equity didn't go up as fast as it did in Montgomery County. Reason being was that Montgomery County is more diverse. So you have, Native Americans, you have Indians, you have Hispanics, you have a wealth of people. That's why the equity went up higher, and they were able to turn those homes over when the housing market started to level out. Whereas PG County, it took twice as long for that to happen. And now they're just getting to the point where they can kind of boom a little bit, and people are really moving out there and they're starting to see equity in their homes. So things like that is important because it does affect, not only affects our wealth, but it affects our income. So we need to start removing these barriers to education so that people can get educated, go buy these homes and do what they need to do and actually have disposable income so that they can send their kids to school without their kids having to have these massive student loans that they got to deal with for the next 20, 30 years. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, those are great points. The only other thing that I would add to that relates to things that we can do to actually solve this is educating others. I say that under the guise of, Alexis, you brought it up earlier, of, forming an LLC and putting your home into the LLC or putting other of your assets into that. There are certain things that I've been taught and certain things that I've learned over the years that I try to pass on to other people. So one of the things that I say all the time that contributes to the wealth gap is the fact that it's a lack of information. Not necessarily, I mean, there obviously are a lack of resources and a lack of equity, but at the same time, it's a lack of information. I give financial seminars all the time to people, and 90% of the stuff that I say in it, and this is according to the survey results that I give, not necessarily I'm based on what I'm saying, but the survey results that I give back, 90% of the people weren't aware of even half of the items that I talked about, which are doing things like putting your money into high investment return vehicles, buying whole life insurance policies as opposed to term life policies because of the equity you build in that life insurance policy. It's just doing the little things. But again, we don't know to do the little things. We're never taught it. And so that's one way that I think that we can help close the gap is any knowledge that you have, pass it along to others. Whether that's you starting a blog, whether that is you starting a podcast, whether that is you just writing out everything it is that you have and giving them out as pamphlets of information. Doing that can help close the gap. Unfortunately, unless the United States government decides to give, and I'm not necessarily talking about reparation. I'm talking about things that appreciate value and retain value. Like, don't give me $200,000. $200,000 isn't going to help me close the gap. It'll put a small dent in it. I want assets that help me going forward. I want a free education. I want property. I want land. I want investment portfolio. Those are the types of things that I want. Don't give me a $200,000 check that makes up for 400 years of oppression. It doesn't. I want to be on the same level playing field as the other guys. Me and my buddies have a term, and it's a slang term. Well, not really slang. Reginald Lewis actually said it. He's like, why do white guys get to have all the fun? Or it's why should white guys have all the fun? And that's something that I live by. And my thing about it is that I want things to be equal. No, they're not going to be. If we're going to talk about equality, let's actually have that conversation as opposed to in the floated around.
Brandon, a good point you brought up was regarding free education as a potential solution to closing the wealth gap. Maybe as a part of reparations or just as a solution to closing the wealth gap. But I think as far as mechanisms that could be used to close that wealth gap, I think one thing that would have to be considered is what would the government be willing to do to close that gap, or what's a reasonable amount of difference? Like, how much would they be willing to close it? So like right now, the median wealth for like a Black family, not considering pensions or anything, is around $24,000. Before a white family, it's around $189,000. So what would the government be willing to do? Would they say, okay, well, you guys can get to $70,000, or will you get to 100,000? And looking at it from that aspect, I could see pushback for that from the government. While I do think it is needed, I do think that would be hard to accomplish. Also, regarding the education piece, it would be easier to accept if a Black person with a bachelor's working in the field made the same as a white person with a bachelor's in the field. There's a difference even there. I was looking at some studies, and Black professionals with college degrees and advanced degrees make close to what white professionals with high school diplomas make. So I'm not sure what mechanism could be used to kind of steer that ship in a proper direction, but maybe some income regulation. I mean, but that sounds that kind of pushes some people away, even just thinking about something similar to that. But I do agree with what you and Alexis have said. It's about information sharing and just spreading that information and making sure people are aware of things. Just like you said, a lot of these different financial and just things about real estate and things of that nature, we didn't pick that up. I can say for myself, a lot of things I learned were, after I started working for myself after I grew up. So I do agree that, for a real move forward would be to just communicate with each other and spread that information that, seems to be hidden from us at times.
So can I add to that, to what both of you are saying? Great points. And not to sound controversial again when I say this, I think we got to start speaking the same language. Mm-hmm. Right? Historically, we were separated so that we couldn't communicate with one another. And it's not just about, I would piggyback off what you're saying, as far as teach next one, share the information. We, though, as a community, have to start speaking the same language. And that's not just the 3 college graduates on this call, but looking at communities like Chicago, looking at Detroit, looking at places where there's gang infestations or there's low income, where the schools are bad, things of that nature. Go to Philly, wherever you can pick, where we heavily populate these areas. The separation of us on a slave trade, on a slave ship, it had its effects year after year after year. And I think we can even go back, as a Hampton graduate, and I look at the works of W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington. Do we revolt, or do we get an education and try to work our way out, right? There's always going to be that dichotomy. And typically what I've seen, even if we look back over the last couple of summers and how we have the Black Lives Matter movement, there's always this dichotomy of how do we move forward? Do you know how powerful we could be if we all started moving together? Like, I'm for the government changing some stuff. And again, I might be controversial when I say this. Government's not going to change gun laws until we start getting our licenses and we start getting our permits and we start carrying guns. If all of us did that, they're going to start doing some things. All of us start moving in the same direction, it's going to force somebody to make some change somewhere. So we can do all this talk, we can march, we can do whatever we want, but they know we're not united. So they can still do whatever they want. So.
Absolutely. I mean, all great points. Yeah, I mean, that's the best way to close it out. So I want to thank William, want to thank Alexis for your time today. That's all for today's that's all for today's Beautiful Struggle. Thank you for watching. You can see this more at the Black Advancement YouTube channel or at the website www.blackadvancement.com. Until next time, peace and advance.